How important is Aero? Is it just for the pros? Is it wasted on normal cyclists like us? Or can we all benefit? To find out, in this video, I had a conversation with Nathan Barry, who has a PhD in applied aerodynamics and works with Cannondale as a lead design engineer. He developed a brand new SuperSix Evo, which launched just a few weeks ago. So before we dive into the details of the brand new bike, can we talk more generally about how important aero is? I mean, some people say it doesn't make any difference, they don't ride fast enough, or the hills don't need aero, so can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you the cliff notes. It can get complex, but the simple fact is that for most cycling, aerodynamics is the biggest piece of resistance that you have to overcome. I think people lose sight sometimes of where all your power goes. If you're someone with a power meter, you have these numbers displayed, but people don't think where those numbers are going. So on a flat road, on a good road bike with good tires, 80–90% of your power might be going into just overcoming aerodynamic drag. So if you're talking about, often the fun part of cycling of going fast, most of your power is going to be aerodynamic drag. So when you're talking about a bike, even though it's one part of the system, you can save 5–10% of drag on the whole system just by optimizing the bike alone. So if you think about 10% improvement in efficiency is equivalent to 10% more power, basically. So that's a huge boost in performance if you can get those kind of big gains, which are possible if you compare something like the new Evo versus a more traditional round tube, round seat post type design.
And can you get the gains at lower speeds? Because lots of bike brands talk about 45k an hour sort of speed, which pros do, but for mid-mortals, we're riding 30k an hour. So do we still get the benefits at those low speeds?
Yeah, absolutely. So my sort of quick and easy measure here is if you do the maths on all the terms, at 15 kilometers an hour on a flat road, 50% of your energy is overcoming drag. And then that number obviously keeps going up the faster you go because aerodynamics is proportional to velocity. So, even when you're just cruising around town, if you're on, something that's efficient tires and things like that, city bikes often have chunky tires and wheels. So there's some other things at play. But on a road bike, basically anyone going for a road ride has to push a lot of air out of the way. So as soon as you're moving, you're having to fight the air. And that's why aerodynamics kind of is an important factor at all stages of road riding. Because even when you're going up a hill, it's not the biggest piece of the pie anymore because the hill is kind of the big draw, but you're still moving forward. And anytime you're moving, you're having to push through the air. And so that resistance is always there.
So a certain gradient or percentage where sort of aero kind of stops becoming the factor and weight and gravity takes over?
Obviously it's a trade-off, right? So it's how much aerodynamics are you saving versus how much weight there is. The weight versus aero thing depends a lot on the proportions of each, right? How big the aero reduction is, how different the weight change is. So a pretty simple rule is if you take a 1 kilogram change in mass and don't change anything else, for a typical rider going up, say, a 8% climb, a very difficult climb, 1 kilogram might be in the vicinity of 3 watts of power. It's not a very big amount. And that is basically because the bike is sort of a small part of the system. This is what people tend to forget a little bit about bike weight, is that when you're figuring out how much power you need to climb a hill, most of that energy is getting yourself up the hill. So, for normal people, a bike is maybe 10% of your weight, 7% of your body weight. So as a system, if you save 1 kilogram off the bike, that's a huge difference for an 8 kilo bike, say, versus 7 kilo. But for a 70-something kilo rider plus a 7 kilo bike, changing a kilogram is 1%, 1.5%. So if you think about that weight saving, that's kind of the proportional change in efficiency. And so, a kilogram is very easy to offset in terms of aerodynamic savings. And then when you get to a bike like this, basically what we're trying to achieve is how do you have your cake and eat it too? So you get all the aero savings without having to give up anything on the other side.
Yeah. And come to the bike, which is the most important part of the bike? Is it the wheels, the frame, fork, handlebars, combination of all those
Yeah,
parts?
how do you say which is most important? I guess I don't have a good answer because it's kind of everything working together.
Okay.
When we approach this, it's taking learnings from our previous generations of bikes. Sort of from System 6 and third generation Evo, we learned a lot about each element. and I'm able to go through and break down. So obviously some parts of the frame work more than others. So things like the top tube, not at all affecting drag because it's parallel to the flow and it's behind a whole bunch of other things. But the front wheel, the fork blades, the seat tube, these things are all seeing really high speed air. And so those need to be working efficiently. But in the context of the bike, it's really about, the design process was looking at each element and thinking about how do we optimize this the best. So there's, design elements, there's mechanical elements, and there's aerodynamic. And so for certain features, it's like, okay, if we take the seat post as an example, all right, we know we can hit certain mechanical sort of benchmarks. So how do we make it as aerodynamic as possible, and how does that limit us? So, as a little case study there, the seat post is really narrow on this bike. It's probably one of the narrowest on a road bike. And that allows us to have not a particularly deep seat post, so it keeps sort of a more classic aesthetic. But then that forced us to change other things like move the Di2 battery, which is extremely common to see in a seat post, but then we're sort of reshuffling those things because we've got that as a priority. So it just kind of shows how, each of these decisions trickles down to other parts of the bike. So you sort of have to understand the whole package and how they all work together and talk to one another.
Yeah, you put a Di2 battery in the down tube in the port, which I've never seen before. That's quite a clever solution to that problem of putting the seat post in there.
Right, and then obviously it's convenient if you travel.
Yes.
So, or just if you're tinkering, right? Like when you've got a new bike and you're trying to get the saddle height just right, being able to move around with those things and not risk accidentally dropping a wire or whatever when you're out riding. So,
okay.
It's sort of, sometimes when you change the paradigm, you stumble onto something that's even better than before, not just like a compromise or a workaround. It's like, oh, actually there's another way that we could be doing this.
Okay. When it comes to performance, how much faster is it than the old bike, and how does it compare to the key rivals like Specialized, Trek, and so on?
Sure. So our sort of my vision when we started this just conceptually was like, how do we make a race bike that can be ridden everywhere but doesn't sacrifice on aerodynamics? So that's where we sort of took the last chassis and looked at how do we turn this into a 6.8, 7 kilo race bike, but keep aero performance. So I wanted to be able to match our competitors' dedicated aero platforms, but in something that was, what people expect for their climbing bike. So in our testing, we've benchmarked against a lot of things, but from a lot of the key competitors like Specialized, Tarmac, Trek, this is quicker than that. And I'd be confident that most of our EF riders are going to be lining up in the peloton with probably the fastest bike and not giving up much weight on any given day.
And how close is it to the System 6, your pure aero bike? Does that mean, is this so fast the aero bike no longer needed in the range?
That was my goal.
Okay.
I pushed it to myself to see, in this development, how far could we take it? So we didn't quite get there. This is about kind of 2/3 of the way between Evo 3 and System 6. So
okay.
It's a sort of abstract reference, but Evo 3 was already pretty competitive. This has now taken it to kind of hitting the benchmark kind of what people consider a low drag race bike. And then System 6 has a little headroom above that. So if you're a sprinter or you're riding purely flat races, or you're just somebody that, that's your terrain or that's the way you like to ride, the System 6 still offers some benefits to that person. But for most riders, most of the time, this bike's kind of going to be everything you ever want and need.
More than fast enough, I guess. What's stopping you from getting to the same aero performance as the System 6? What are the sort of hurdles in the way?
A lot of it is that balance between weight and aerodynamics, and you need surface area to manage the air. So if you take like a classic aerofoil profile from a wing, for example, it's like this very long, slender shape. That's kind of the best way to move through the air. So obviously we can't do that practically on a bike. But if you put this side by side with a System 6, the down tube here is maybe 30% shallower. So that's like, 30% less surface area, or more than that, but significantly less surface area. So in the case of carbon structures like this, we're pushing materials at the same time as the rest of the design. So you can only take so many layers of carbon fiber out of a tube before it just doesn't have the strength anymore. So if that tube is really big, you still have a fixed number of layers. So you can only take so much weight out of it. So that kind of goes for all the parts. So, the down tube, the head tube, the seat tube, and the forks are all not quite as deep as they could be. And so that's where you're playing this trade-off where you can't quite get to like the very tip top of that performance and you have to make some sacrifice. But we think that making a bike that's this fast that you can ride, up hills on every mountain stage is going to be the perfect blend of performance. And some of it comes into components as well. So wheels is a pretty big deal. So the wheels here is kind of the same philosophy as the rest of the bike. These are 50s, trying to get even more performance than what we had last generation, but in a lighter package. So they're a little faster and a little lighter than the 45mm deep wheels we had last time, but they still leave a little bit on the table compared to the 64mm that we spec on System 6. And again, it's just more surface area, more material. So you're facing that weight versus aerodynamic argument I talked about before. And at some point you have to kind of draw the line of where do you balance those. Okay. Keeping the weight exactly where we want it and where I think a lot of road riders sort of expect a race bike to be, and then basically extracting every little bit of aerodynamic optimization out of that sort of fixed goal as we could.
Do you look at what rivals are doing, like Specialized and Treks, and look at what they're doing and not take inspiration, but think that's a good idea, or what they're doing with that design?
I think I can't help but do that, right? Like, I'm a bike fan. I've been riding bikes my whole life, basically. And so I just love seeing other bikes out there and people riding them. So I can't help but look every time I see somebody ride past. So yeah, you can't help, whether it's conscious or subconscious. I'm always looking at what other people are up to, and different companies have different philosophies about how they approach certain problems, whether it's, more emphasis on shape or aesthetics or more emphasis on performance. But certainly there are brands out there that, have excellent, talented engineers that are solving the same problems that my team are trying to solve. So we're all approaching them with our own different perspectives. So I think it always helps when you're looking at things, see who's doing something better or different to the way you are, or maybe who's doing something that you don't like that we then want to take on and say, like, this, we don't think this is good enough for what we want to ride. Being a rider, it's easy to look at a bike and be like, if I don't think it's good enough for me, then we should find a better way to do it.
Yeah. And it seems like we're getting to a point where you can almost have a lightweight bike and an aero bike, and it does everything. We don't need two separate bikes anymore. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting there, aren't we, I think?
Yeah, I mean, that was basically the dream for this thing was, can we make something that's, kind of does everything as good as you would ever need? There's always going to be room to push those boundaries more. Like, for example, this is not going to be the lightest bike that you can build, but if you do build a really light bike, you're going to sacrifice a lot of speed. So, I guess it's what you want out of a bike. I think something like this as a package is probably going to be the best all-round experience that people will enjoy, but also the fastest. You can make a lightweight bike that's like, from England, people love to do their hill climb custom builds, but most of those bikes are not that nice to ride.
No.
So, you can push it. It's like a TT bike, right?
Yeah.
Like, we can make really, really fast bikes, but I have TT bikes and I love them, but I don't want to ride it on a weekend with my friends.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. Very compromised. Good at one thing, but not everything else.
The sharper that you make your focus, the more you have to compromise on other elements, basically. And as much as, road bikes are all about racing, but we want to do a lot of different riding with them. Like the capability of a modern road bike compared to one from even 10 years ago is a great example of that. Like, this bike will comfortably fit a 32mm tire if you choose, which that's basically a cyclocross tire. 10 years ago, no one would have put that on a race bike, but you can put that on this and go ride gravel roads, and you know what? You'll be pretty comfortable, and you're still going to be going blisteringly fast.
So pros don't really care about comfort, do they? But us people buying a bike do care about comfort. So how do you factor in comfort when designing a race bike for the pros, but also for the weekend warriors? Yeah,
I think that's something that's evolved. Like, David and Sam on the product team like to talk about Evo having a good history of a smooth, sort of compliant ride. So that's something we try and preserve in all of our race bikes. We have a good lineage of both good handling and comfort. And so understanding what elements go into that so that we can preserve them in each new iteration, because the last thing you want to do is make something new, but then give up something that you had before. We're always trying to build on what we already have. So We have a pretty good understanding of road bike sort of compliance and comfort. If you take a look on the gravel side at like Topstone with its Kingpin sort of active rear end system, it's kind of doing a lot of very complex things with a system that you never have to think about. And so, some of that understanding of how bikes are moving feeds into our road bike design across the board. So we're always thinking about those elements. It's, head tube stiffness and bottom bracket stiffness have kind of been the talking points for a long time. And then seated vertical compliance is something that we test on every new road bike design to make sure we're hitting what we think is the sweet spot for, a performance bike. In the case of the pros, I think they kind of appreciate that a little bit as well, especially if they're racing classics.
Yes.
This is a bike that'll get raced everywhere, so they'll ride it at Flanders and Roubaix and put slightly bigger tyres on it. And then people like you and me get to ride around fast and comfortable and just having a great time.
Sounds good. There's still space for wide tyres, isn't there? So you can fit a fat tyre in there and have all the comfort you want.
Yeah, I think I've run 32 millimeter tyres on mine a couple of times, and it's
which is crazy
smooth
compared to the Gen 1 Evo, which maxed out at 25, I think. Let's see how far we come.
Yep. Yeah, it's been a big change.
Yeah. Last question. I know you finished a bike. You probably started on Gen 5.
Yeah.
Can you give us any indication what to expect in the next 5 or 10 years? And is there anything in the UCI rulebook that's sort of holding you back from making that next step?
I guess the first thing I would comment on is the recent changes to the 3-to-1 rule and things like that. I get asked that a fair bit at the moment.
Can you just clarify what that is just for the viewer?
Sure. So if you're not familiar, there has been a rule from the UCI for some time, which means that tubes have a set aspect ratio, which is 3-to-1. So the length can only be 3 times the width or depth, depending on your orientation. So for example, if it's 10 millimeters wide, it can be no more than 30 millimeters long. So you sort of have this slenderness ratio, and that rule's gone away. So in theory, I could make the seat post keep going and come back all the way to a point.
Wow, okay.
But does that make a better bike? So that kind of comes back to what I was talking about of understanding the trade-offs here.
Yeah.
If you make all of the tubes very deep and very thin, they become increasingly stiff in that axis, which is not the axis that we're particularly interested in for a bike. So you then have sort of less balanced torsional stiffness, more stiffness in an axis that you don't want, and all of that extra surface area, which adds weight. So how much does that get you in terms of aerodynamic gains? And in a lot of cases, it's not that much. If you've got shapes that are working very well, adding a lot of depth doesn't necessarily help you that much. If I just make this fork twice as deep, I'm probably allowed to now, according to the UCI.
Okay.
But does that make the bike better? Probably not. And then it's a question of how much drag might you save versus weight. So for a bike like this, maybe I could make certain parts of the fork. I think it's going to be more around the edges. It's going to be certain areas where we're diving or skirting around the rules to make sure we conform. Now we might be able to sort of smooth things out a little bit more. But I don't think you're going to see a rapid change in the way bikes look just because that rule has changed. And if you do, I would be very interested to ride it because I think it will have some pretty interesting characteristics.
Okay.